Hi and welcome to today's live chapter reading of The Earl and the Peahen by Wilde, courtesy of Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. Newcastle upon Tyne, December 1820. There was never a dull moment in the Mayfield household. With 4 daughters in residence between the ages of 17 and 25, there was no shortage of drama and excitement. The squeals of surprise and delight that emanated from the parlour a few days before Christmas wouldn't have caused any member of the staff to bat an eyelid, except it was Jane Mayfield, the eldest and most sensible of the Mayfield brood, who was eliciting such an exuberant response. How is it that out of all of us that Jane would be invited to stay with a countess for the entire London season? It's just not fair, Matilda wailed, launching herself into her father's startled embrace. Jane raised a brow, unimpressed by her younger sister's antics. Do try to regulate your emotions, she chastised, or one might think you wish your own sister ill. Sir Augustus Mayfield tutted and patted his youngest daughter affectionately. Now, don't be cross, puss. You should be happy for Janie. Just think, she'll be sponsored by a countess and introduced to many eligible gentlemen. If she makes a good match, it would improve all your chances. Don't you think so, Rosalind? Augustus Mayfield was a good-natured man with a kind disposition. He was a popular member of the community and openly doted on all his daughters. Sadly, he was also a weak man who disliked conflict. The baronet had discovered early in his marriage that the simplest method to achieve peace was to defer to his wife in all matters, from the financial management of their estates to the disciplining of their offspring. While Jane adored her father and felt compelled to side with him against her tyrannical mother, she often found it hard to respect him. Lady Rosalind Mayfield nodded, finally looking up from her unexpected letter Jane had handed her that morning. It's undoubtedly an excellent opportunity. I had no idea you'd made such an impression on Lady Digby during your short stint in the capital. Jane shrugged. Cousin Caroline introduced me to the Countess when I accompanied her to London earlier this year. She's a kind lady and took us under her wing during our brief visits. To be honest, Jane hadn't thought she'd made that much of an impression either. But what her family didn't know was that she'd received 2 letters from Lady Digby. The formal invitation which she'd handed to her mother and a private note that she'd locked in her writing desk. Digby, is it? Yes, I recall that the Earl is something of a politician in London, her father volunteered. Her mother, who read all the society papers, was quick to share her take on the matter. That's a recent development. He was the unlikely heir to an earldom, never expected to succeed to the title, except his cousin went off and got himself killed. Then, instead of marrying a proper young lady of the town, he married that woman. What's wrong with the Countess? Beatrice, Jane's next oldest sister, asked. Lady Mayfield gave an exaggerated shudder. She was a member of the Derry Monde, famously known as La Belle Beaumont. Everyone knew her or of her. She was a notorious mistress of some of the country's most influential men. She was also the daughter of a viscount with the breeding and education of a lady, Jane added, feeling the need to defend her friend. Her mother huffed. There's only so much an advantageous marriage can do for one's reputation. I myself don't understand how she's tolerated, let alone accepted in polite society. Sir Mayfield frowned. Maybe it isn't such a good idea for Jane to accept her invitations. We don't want to risk any scandal, ruin her chances. But Papa, Jane began. Nonsense, her mother declared. If left to her own devices, Jane would have absolutely no chance of making a good match. You remember how abysmal her come-out was 8 years ago? Staying with a countess, even one with such a questionable past, is bound to improve her already slim chances. It certainly can't make them any worse. Jane's temper flared, but she held it in check, schooling her features into a neutral expression. May I write back and accept her invitation, then? Her mother waved her hand. Very well. I suppose we'll have to send you in the carriage. Such an extravagance, but you can't appear on the doorstep in a stagecoach. Clenching her fist, Jane rose and hurried towards the door. Before she could make her escape, her mother called her back. "Oh, and Jane, we'll all be in town later in the season. It's much too expensive for you to go for the full duration. Your younger sisters need to spend some time in polite society. I expect you to make a good impression while in London, and do your utmost to help your sisters secure good matches. Surely you want better for them." "Better than ending up a spinster like you," were her mother's unspoken words. Jane gave her a tight smile and fled the room, Beatrice hurrying on her heels. Since Bee was her favourite sister and her staunchest ally in the household, Jane led her into the bedchamber, closing the door behind them. "Pay no heed to Mamma's words," Beatrice advised. "You know what she's like." "Oh, I know. In her eyes, a woman's only true accomplishment is her beauty. It stings her pride to no end that she produced a plain creature such as myself. To add insult to injury, I can't seem to bring myself to be miserable about it." Jane had in fact come to terms with her looks, or lack thereof, years ago, but it was a source of endless consternation for her mother. It was therefore fortunate for the entire family's well-being that the rest of the Mayfield brood had all turned out to be lovely. One black sheep was quite enough. Beatrice smiled, having taken part in many similar conversations in the past. "You're perfectly lovely just the way you are. Now, tell me more about this Countess's invitation." Jane walked to her writing desk, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out the letter she'd placed in there. "Lady Digby sent me 2 notes, the one I gave to Mamma, and this private one." Beatrice took the letter and read it out loud. "Dear Miss Mayfield, we don't know each other very well, and I doubt you expected to hear from me after our brief encounter in London. However, it's come to my attention that your actions helped save a dear friend of mine from scandal and perhaps an even more sinister fate. Most people wouldn't choose to side with their cousin and a gentleman, architect they barely know, over their own mother, and yet you did. I'm a firm believer that kindness should be rewarded. I remember your fondness for London and your desire to experience another season to secure a good match. It would be my pleasure to sponsor you and act as your chaperone. I've enclosed another more formal invitation for you to share with your family. Please say yes and allow me this small token of appreciation. I shall await your reply. Yours truly, Isabel Gilbert, Countess of Digby." Beatrice's brows creased as she handed the note back to Jane. "Is Lady Digby referring to that failed plot involving cousin Caroline and the architect she hired from London?" "You mean when Caroline's mother-in-law conspired with Mamma to get rid of her? Yes, that's exactly what she's referring to. Although I had no idea the Countess knew Mr. Benson. She's grossly exaggerating my role, of course, but I do appreciate the sentiment." "Then you must reply and accept her invitation at once. Go to London and find a husband. This is your best chance to get away from Mamma and enjoy a season without her criticising your every move." Jane pulled her sister in for an impulsive hug. "You're right, it's too good an opportunity to pass up. I shall miss you, though." Beatrice chuckled and stepped back. "Nonsense, you'll be too busily finally living your life. Be smart, Jane. Make a match, any match, and don't return. It's not just your happiness on the line, you know. Once you set up your own household, I'll finally have an excuse to quit Newcastle. Why, I end up staying with you for months on end." "I shall keep your future travel ambitions in mind," Jane promised with wry amusement. "Very well, I shall write Lady Digby back and accept her invitation." She paused and then added, "But Bee—" "Yes?" She wrung her hand suddenly, feeling uncertain. "Do you think I have unrealistic expectations? Perhaps I'm suffering from self-delusion, as Mamma keeps suggesting, and I'm too old and too plain to secure a good match." Her sister considered her. "I believe that people get their just deserts. You're a good person, Jane, and you deserve to have good things happen to you. I have a feeling this London season will be your grandest adventure yet." Chapter 1. Digby House, Mayfair, London, April 1821. "I do believe I'm cursed," Jane Mayfield grumbled as she threw herself inelegantly onto a settee in the drawing-room. Her friend and hostess, Lady Isabel Gilbert, Countess of Digby, looked up from the book she'd been reading to squint at her. "Truly? Which type?" The one where a witch curses you in retaliation for your father's sins, or the type prophesied by a mystical astronomer at the time of your birth? Jane snorted. You read far too many fairy tales for a woman of your age. Unperturbed, Isabel shrugged. I can't very well read the Odyssey to a child now, can I? I suppose not, although I don't think I'd enjoy being in one of young Arthur's books. The only interesting characters are the villains, and they all seem to be driven by the pettiest and most nonsensical motives. Besides, you don't know it's unfashionable for a countess to take in such an active interest in her child. If the elite members of the ton knew that you read to your son every night, they'd start treating you like a social pariah. Or I could be setting a new trend. Just imagine high-born ladies actually rearing their offspring instead of leaving that duty to their nurses. Jane smirked. She very much enjoyed her conversations with the Countess of Digby, who was witty and shockingly unorthodox. Her husband Francis was just as unconventional, spending far more time at home with his wife and son than at his club. Since it's clearly not a curse of the fictional variety, Isabel continued, setting her book aside, why would you say you're doomed? With a deep sigh, Jane pulled out a letter from a fold in her dress and held it up to show her companion. This arrived by messenger half an hour ago. It's from Judge Bailey. He approached the subject of marriage and plans to call on me later this week to discuss the details in person. Isabel sat up straighter, her gaze sharpening. I knew he was interested, but I didn't know he planned an offering for you so soon. Your parents aren't even in town yet. Yes, Bailey is aware of that. Since I'm 25, he feels I'm old enough to know my own mind. Speaking with my father is merely a formality. So a proposal from a wealthy, high-esteemed judge means you're cursed. Sighing again, Jane fiddled with the corner of the letter before responding. I'm cursed to attract men who are at least 20 years my senior. Of my past 4 beaux, the retired army captain, the widowed squire, the village physician, and the Baron's steward, the youngest was 45 years old. They were all deemed too common for a baronet's daughter, so my parents thankfully declined their suits. I have nothing against older gentlemen, and I admit Sir Benedict Bailey is in excellent condition for his age. I'm not about to dismiss his proposal out of hand. I really wanted a younger suitor this time, not a man who's old enough to be my father. Her companion tilted her head to the side, considering her. Marrying a more mature man is not the worst thing you could do, you know. Not to sound ungracious, but it isn't the best I can do either, Jane retorted. Consider, my dear, you're the daughter of a minor baronet from Northumberland. Your father, who's not particularly wealthy, struggled to scrape together a small dowry for you as well as your 3 younger sisters. You know he'll accept Bailey's suit in a heartbeat. Unlike your previous suitors, the judge has wealth, position, and a knighthood. At least give the man a sporting chance to win your affections. Jane got to her feet and began to pace. Her mother would have scolded her and ordered her to sit like a proper lady. Luckily, she was hundreds of miles away from her overbearing parents. Isabel didn't seem to mind and just sat patiently waiting for her to respond. Finally, Jane drew to a halt and sucked in a deep breath. I feel like I'm being backed into a corner. The judge is not the kind of husband I wanted for myself. But on the other hand, if I reject him and receive no other offers, by the end of the season, I might come to bitterly regret it. Don't be such a morose goose, Isabel scolded. You can always reject Bailey's offer. Your parents might try to cajole or bully you into accepting him, but at the end of the day it's your choice. Besides, what about that letter you received the other day? The one from your friend back home. She was referring to the letter Jane had received from one of her oldest friends, Agnes Taylor. Agnes's aunt was arranging a marriage for her to a gentleman in the colonies. Being in need of a companion and chaperone, Agnes had invited Jane to accompany her to America. It's certainly an option, Jane replied slowly, but I'd like to think of it as a last resort. I'd much rather marry and settle in England, although perhaps I'd have better luck finding a younger husband in the colonies, not to mention living far away from her mother.